Moscow, January 1960. What is this? I asked Mr. Satnyakov as I reached across the top of his highly polished teak wood desk, stained with burn marks from Cuban cigars, to take the thick folder which he slid towards me. Pavel Satnyakov was a well-built man with thick, dark hair framing his receding hairline. Years ago, he was a journalist, just as I am now, before the party appointed him editor-in-chief of Pravda back in 1956. Though in his early 50s, Satyakov still retained the inquisitive demeanor of a young and enthusiastic correspondent. This was an aspect about him that seemed to keep him looking perpetually young. He motioned for me to take a seat in front of his desk as his secretary, a beautiful young intern named Dorotia, turned to leave his spacious and very well-organized office. "Miss Ilyan," said Mr. Satnyakov in his baritone voice that always reminded me of that American singer, Elvis Presley. "Some tea for myself and Mr. Zimyanin, please, and kindly make it hot." "Of course, Mr. Satnyakov," smiled Dorotia as she closed the door behind her, shielding us from the noise of endless conversations, typewriters, and telephone calls which one would expect to come from the party's official newspaper workroom. Outside the Pravda office building, Moscow was blanketed under a foot of snow, and our building's heating system was struggling just to keep the temperature at a tolerable level. "That, my dear Mikhail," said Mr. Satnyakov, turning his attention to me, "is your next assignment. Look it over, my boy. Do you remember the story?" A sticker on the folder read,
Kholat Shaki Mountain Incident, February 1959.
"This happened a little over a year ago," I said, opening up the file and removing several newspaper articles, pictures, as well as official government documents, which I had not seen before. This story caused quite a stir of speculation for a while. "Indeed," said Mr. Satnyakov, staring at me intently. I took out a few grainy black and white photographs of young people dressed as if they were going hiking in the mountains. It was attached by paperclip to an article dated 20th February 1959, which read,
Army and local militia units search for missing hikers on snow-covered Kholat Shaki slopes.
The article mentioned that 9 students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute had formed a hiking club and had set out in January of that year on a hiking trip up the eastern slopes of the Kholat Mountains, which the native Manasi people called
the Dead Mountain.
The eldest of the 9 hikers was a 38-year-old male named Semyon A. Zolotaryov. The youngest was a 20-year-old female named Ludmila A. Dubenina. The leader of the hiking expedition was a 23-year-old radio engineering student by the name of Igor A. Dyatlov. The article continues that when the 20th of February rolled around and no telegram of the hikers' progress was received, the worried families appealed to the military and locals to begin a search of the area, as a winter storm had arisen in the slopes sometime between late January to the first week of February. The second set of pictures that I looked at was much clearer and obviously taken with a higher quality camera. The 4 images showed several men in dark uniforms looking over what remained of a campsite on a gently sloping hill which was covered in snow. The remains of a relatively large tent, half buried in the snow, was in the foreground with only the front and rear stakes sticking up. The sides and the rear flap had collapsed as if they had been cut away, leaving only the front flap drooping off the stake. These pictures were attached to a larger newspaper article dated the 1st of March, 1959, which read,
Searchers find damaged and abandoned campsite.
The subheading of the article read,
Tents found torn and cut open from the inside, and 9 sets of footprints seen running towards the woods.
I mean, this was an unusual case, I said, reading the names of the 9 victims. All 9 of the victims were found some distance away from the shelter of the tent, wearing very little clothing. Some of them weren't even wearing socks. It was concluded that 6 of the hikers, including Dyatlov, died of extreme hypothermia. But 3 of the hikers, including young Miss Dubenina and the eldest, Mr. Zolotaryov, died of severe chest trauma and not hypothermia. I put down the file and looked at Mr. Satyakov. Why are we looking into this again, sir? Last May, the official investigation closed with the finding that the 9 died of fatal natural forces. There was no evidence of other footprints outside of the 9 hikers, and thus no ruling of foul play by the Manasi people or predation by wild animals. There came a knocking at the door as Miss Ilian returned with a serving tray of spiced Kuzmi tea. Pouring the steaming drink into 2 china cups, Miss Ilian politely excused herself, leaving Mr. Satyakov and I to finish our discussion. "Again, you are right, my dear Mikhail," said Satyakov, taking a sip of his hot tea and smiling in approval as he leaned back in his chair. "That is the official finding of what is now being called the Dyatlov Pass incident, in memory of Igor Dyatlov, and I assume that would have been the official conclusion and the case would be closed, except for 2 details which did not make it into the official statement on the matter." I sweetened my tea with a little honey and blew into it to cool it down before taking a sip. The hot, spicy beverage warmed me greatly, instantly taking the chill out of my body. I arched my eyebrows at my editor-in-chief. There was something left out of the official conclusion? I asked, not really surprised that the party would leave out other details in order to preserve security and order. Mr. Satyakov took another sip of the tea and said nothing as he motioned with a nod for me to keep looking into the file. There were 2 other reports in their own separate envelopes, and both of these designated as secret by the Ministry of Defense. I looked at my boss with hesitation. "Go ahead, Mikhail," said Mr. Satyakov. "Go ahead and open them." Trying to restrain my eagerness, I opened the first letter, dated the 26th of February. It was a copy of a simple 1-page memo written by an officer in charge of an Army radiation detection unit that was part of the search team. The letter was addressed to an Army divisional commander stationed in the area. In short, it stated that low levels of radiation had been found on the clothing which the hikers wore, but none on the clothing which was found inside the remains of their tent. Curious, I opened the second envelope. This one contained copies of 4 separate reports, 2 from Manasi villagers, 1 from a hunter, and 1 from a military meteorological unit who had been on the ridgeline several kilometers opposite of the slope in which the hikers had camped. All of them describing seeing some type of glowing orange orb descending out of the sky like fire in the vicinity of Dyatlov Pass. As I sat contemplating the ramifications of what I had just read, I noticed a small brown envelope like one to keep photographs in, tucked under the last report. Taking another hot sip of my tea, I nearly spat it out on Satyakov's desk as I pulled the photograph on the envelope. "Good Lord," I said. "Mr. Satyakov, what is that?" "Like I said," my boss responded calmly. "The government was well and perfectly happy with the conclusion of their investigation, and would have been content to leave the story as is." He leaned forward and put his elbows on his desk, his eyebrows furrowed in concern. "However, since the investigation concluded in May of last year, 17 other people have vanished in the vicinity of the pass. 3 disappeared in May that year, then 4 in December, and 10 since January of this year. Mikhail, the military is going back in to Dyatlov's Pass with considerably more resources. News of the disappearances cannot be covered up for long, especially with the military going back in force. They think that it is wise to have a civilian correspondent embedded with them, which is why I'm sending you." I leaned back, looking in disbelief at the picture. "And they think that the disappearances of Dyatlov's group and the subsequent missing people have something to do with the thing in this picture?" "Perhaps. That is what they are going in to find out. You will be filling your reports directly to the mission commander. His name is Colonel Stanislav Andreev. The military feels that having a civilian reporter as opposed to a military one will bring some element of transparency to the operation, or rather investigation." Of course, anything you report will naturally have to go through military intelligence to be edited and redacted in order to keep security in order. It was a 5-hour flight from Moscow International to the Urals, not including the 2-hour delay while maintenance crews de-iced the runways. It was a little after 3 p.m. when our sturdy Aeroflot IL-18 turboprop landed on the snow-swept runway of Koltsovo International. The metal stairs were brought to the plane, and after the doors opened, the biting chill in the air drove away any heat in the passenger cabin. And here I thought Moscow was a deep freezer. I gathered my things and descended the stairs to the tarmac, pulling the hood of my white winter coat over my face. To my surprise, an army major wearing a heavy cold weather coat and his driver were waiting for me with a Gaz 67 Jeep at the foot of the stairs, a look of annoyance on his face. "Mr. Zemyanin," he said. "Mr. Mikhail Zemyanin." "Yes, Major, that's me." The name on the officer's uniform read Rogov. "You're late," he said briskly, grabbing my bag and putting it in the trunk. I had been told specifically what I could and could not bring by the military, which was basically warm clothing for the trip to the Urals, toilet articles, a camera, and a few other small things. The military said that they would provide everything that I would need for the duration of their investigation. The Major, Rogov, looked suspiciously at me when he noticed that I'd rather keep my camera with me rather than have it packed in the back. It belonged to the newspaper, and I could not afford to have it damaged. "There was a 2-hour weather delay in Moscow," I said. "I'm sorry." "I see," answered Rogov, ushering me into the back seat before climbing into the passenger side. "Colonel Andreev will not be pleased with the delay. He was expecting you hours ago. You and the others were the last element that he was waiting for before he could start this operation." "The others?" I asked. "You'll see, Mr. Zemyanin," Rogov answered. "Driver, take us to the hangar." The 5-minute Jeep ride took us across the entire airport to a lonely, dilapidated hangar on the far side of the runway. In front of it was parked a military Mi-4 transport helicopter painted in shades of white, light olive, and light gray. There was a big red star emblazoned on its side. The engines were already started and warming by the time we arrived as the Major leapt from his seat before the Jeep fully stopped and ran to a door next to the hangar that was barely on its hinges. Not knowing what to do next, I simply followed Major Rogov out of the Jeep. Throwing open the door to the hangar, Major Rogov shouted, "Okay, the reporter is here. Pick up your gear and get on the helicopter quickly. The weather is getting worse and the window is closing to fly. Colonel Andreev does not want to waste another day." Immediately, 8 young soldiers began filing out of the ramshackle old hangar, each carrying SKS rifles, as well as peculiar-looking equipment, which I would not usually associate with a combat unit. This was some kind of specialized unit, and the equipment and devices which they hauled into the helicopter filled me with apprehension. The implications of what we were bringing with us made me extremely nervous. Why would the Army need so much radiation detection equipment? Turning to me, the Major looked down at my camera and said, "You won't be taking any pictures until you officially have permission from Colonel Andreev." I understand, Major," I answered. Though the sky was still relatively clear, the wind was picking up, indicating that another snow flurry was not far off. "Where are we going?" "Khanty-Mansiysk. It's about 400 kilometers northeast of here." Major Rogov turned to fetch my bag from the back of the Jeep and handed it to me. "You'll be there within 2 hours or so." I waited until the soldiers loaded all of their equipment into the helicopter, as the rotors began picking up speed and spinning faster. Though the Mi-4 could hold up to 14 soldiers, it was still rather cramped with the 9 of us in the passenger cabin, what with all the radiological detection equipment that the soldiers brought. Yelling to be heard above the roar of the rotor blades, the Major had some last-minute instructions to the junior lieutenant who was in charge of the group of soldiers, telling them that he would be arriving separately later that evening. I had boarded last and was seated near the exit door when Major Rogov came to me and yelled, "Mr. Zemyanin, after you get to Khanty-Mansiysk, as soon as you get the opportunity, go see Sergeant Galkin. He is the unit supply sergeant and armorer. He will have your additional winter clothing and other supplies that you will need to complete your mission." "Okay," I yelled down at the captain from my seat, perched up in the helicopter. "Sergeant Galkin, thank you." "And one more thing," yelled Rogov as the helicopter throttled up to take off. "Ask Sergeant Galkin if you can sign for a pistol, just in case." The long helicopter flight through the bleak, cold skies was reasonably comfortable. The cabin heaters were working fine, and the vibration of the engines served to make some of the soldiers drowsy. I tried to strike up a conversation with the team's commanding officer, a young junior lieutenant named Leonid Orlov. He stated that he and his men had recently completed training in the use of the Army's most advanced radiological detecting and monitoring equipment when they were suddenly tasked to be part of this mission to the Ural Mountains. He mentioned that there would also be 2 mechanized infantry companies attached to the mission, but aside from that, he had little other useful information. Seeing as I was a civilian reporter who had also embedded to this mission, Orlov asked me if I had any information about the nature of this unusual assignment, and if the rumors were true that we would be looking for missing people around what they were now calling Dyatlov's Pass. I shook my head and said that I was as clueless as everybody else, even as I remembered the picture of the strange object that I saw in Mr. Satyakov's office. Lieutenant Orlov nodded, though I sensed that he didn't quite believe me. To my great surprise, Khanty-Mansiysk Airport looked more like a military encampment rather than small regional airport it was. Spread out across the small parking lot and runway, there were military vehicles of all shapes and sizes. BTR-152, 6-wheeled light armored transport vehicles, newer BTR-50s, tracked armored transports, and several GAZ-67 Jeeps. We landed next to a line of Mi-4 transport helicopters and smaller Mi-1 light utility helicopters. Lieutenant Orlov immediately ordered his men to secure their weapons and equipment and get off the helicopter. Though it was after 6 p.m., the skies were noticeably clearer in this higher elevation, though still quite cold. Another captain, who was wearing a comfortable-looking tan fleece winter coat and a thick fleece Ushanka winter cap, was waiting for our helicopter to land. He directed Orlov's men to secure their equipment and make their way to one of the 12 tents which were erected next to the airport's modest terminal building. Turning to me and Lieutenant Orlov, the captain introduced himself. "I'm Captain Sidorev, 15th Mountain Infantry Battalion of the 128th Motor Rifle Division. You will be following under our command. Follow me to the terminal, gentlemen. Colonel Andreev has turned it into his command post for this operation, and he is eager to get started." Captain Sidorev turned and walked briskly towards the glass-fronted, white terminal building which had recently been rebuilt and expanded. As I shouldered my travel bag and followed Orlov and Captain Sidorev across the tarmac towards the airport terminal, I was puzzled to see several dozen of our soldiers hustling about attending to their vehicles, weapons, and equipment. I was even more surprised to see them mounting DSHK 1938 heavy machine guns on both the tracked and wheeled armored vehicles. I had served with the 106th Guard Division during the Great Patriotic War as an airborne infantryman, so to me this looked less like preparations for a military search mission to find missing people, and more like preparations for a ground assault into enemy territory. My mind was racing faster than the chilling winds which blew around us as we neared the terminal. Could that be the answer? Over 3 million Germans invaded our country during the war. Could a group of those rogue fascist Nazi soldiers have held out in the vast, lonely Ural Mountains, killing anyone who might have gotten too close to their hideaway? It isn't an unheard of scenario, as abandoned Japanese soldiers were still turning up on isolated islands in the South Pacific who don't know that the war is long over. That had to be the answer. But then why the need for radiological equipment? Worse, could the Americans somehow be involved? Could they have used some type of weapon against us? One which left radioactive residue behind? The warm rush of air greeted us as we entered the building, the expanded terminal empty of all civilian travelers. "The government closed down the airport to all travel when this investigation started," said Captain Sidorev, picking up the pace as he ascended the main stairwell to the second floor. "No civilian flights are allowed in or out of the area within a radius of 1,500 kilometers. and only authorized military flights are allowed inside of the exclusion zone. He turned to me, saying, Mr. Zemyanin, I'm not sure if you have already been told, but all correspondence that you write and photographs that you take must go through the Colonel personally before they may be sent to your editor. I understand, Captain, I said as we reached the second story. Unlike downstairs, the second story was awash with military activity. Rooms lined the large circular landing which looked down on the ground floor, each seemingly assigned to fulfill a certain function. As Captain Sidorev led us around the landing, I saw a large room filled with communication specialists, another with maps and meteorological specialists, radar operators, surface-to-air missile operations specialists, and a host of other specialized military elements which, apparently, were needed for this so-called investigation. Sidorev stopped in front of a wooden door and knocked 3 times before turning the knob. The door opened to a surprisingly small room which looked to have been converted into an office. A grim-faced officer with close-cropped white hair and cold blue, unblinking eyes that seemed to criticize everything he saw looked up at us from behind a simple metal desk. Colonel Andreev, saluted Captain Sidorev. The last elements have arrived. Thank you, Sidorev, said the colonel, standing up abruptly, his chair screeching across the floor. Rejoin your men. They will have an early morning start tomorrow, and I want all equipment and vehicles staged and ready to go no later than 0600 hours. Sidorev saluted again before he turned to leave. Colonel Andreev was a huge man with broad shoulders. Instead of wearing a formal officer's uniform complete with the rows of medals he had no doubt earned, Andreev wore a combat uniform, the same as his men. I knew that this was no parade ground officer. Andreev was all business. He leaned forward, placing his hands on the table and glaring at Lieutenant Orlov and me. You're late, gentlemen. I expected you hours ago. Apologies, sir, stammered Lieutenant Orlov, coming to attention and saluting. You see, the weather, Lieutenant Orlov! Colonel Andreev's deep, menacing voice quickly silenced the young lieutenant. How old are you? 23, sir, gulped poor Lieutenant Orlov. 23, huh? Replied Colonel Andreev. Too young to have participated in the Great Patriotic War, then. At 21, I was a lieutenant just like you, and I commanded a battery of Katyusha rocket launchers. During those dark days, we did not have the luxury of blaming the weather for failure. Not when our infantrymen needed us to continue the fight against the fascists. Do you understand, Lieutenant? Colonel, I said, seeing young Lieutenant Orlov seeming to shrink. Lieutenant Orlov and his men were late because they were waiting for me to arrive. I am aware of that, said Andreev, holding up his hand at me while leaving his gaze firmly on Orlov. Lieutenant Orlov, is your equipment operational? Has it been winterized against the cold? Yes, sir, replied Lieutenant Orlov. And did Mr. Zemyanin discuss any aspect of the investigation with you on the ride over? Andreev ignored me, holding his gaze on the lieutenant. What, sir? Said Orlov, briefly looking at me nervously before returning his attention to the colonel. No, sir. Said Andreev, eyeing me with doubt on his face. Okay, Lieutenant Orlov. Half of your men will be attached to Captain Sidorev's infantry company. The other half will go with Captain Kravtsov's men. However, your men will be under command of Major Rogov, my executive officer. They will report immediately to Major Rogov and only Major Rogov if they pick up any unusual increases in radiation during the course of the operation. Understand, Lieutenant? Yes, sir, replied Lieutenant Orlov, confidence slowly returning to his voice. May I know what we are looking for? No, replied Andreev. You and your men will do your duties, nothing more, nothing less, and with no excuses for failure. At 0500 hours in the morning, you and your men will report to Major Rogov to receive your orders. Your senior sergeant will lead one team and you the other. You are dismissed, Lieutenant. Orlov saluted swiftly before leaving, grateful that the ordeal of meeting the mission commander was over. He flashed me a sympathetic look before leaving the room. You're still a grumpy old ogre. Do you know that, Stanislav? I said, after Lieutenant Orlov had closed the door behind him. "Do you always insist on making junior officers shit themselves?" Andreev chuckled as he stepped around and took a seat on the corner of the desk. "Kids these days, always asking questions instead of simply following orders. We would never have beaten the fascists with officers like that." He pulled out a cigarette and lit it before offering one to me. "How is your mother doing, Mikhail?" my older cousin asked me. "How is Auntie Milian?" "She's doing fine," I answered, accepting the smoke. "Good. Good to hear," said Andreev, smiling, inhaling deeply as he looked at a military map on the wall of the surrounding area. Circles were drawn on it, indicating that approximate places of the latest disappearances of people in areas of increased levels of radiation. Normally, I would rather have one of our military reporters with us as opposed to having a civilian journalist with us, but the Kremlin thought it was wise to have a civilian with us for credibility purposes once we conclude this investigation and make the results public. Colonel Andreev Stanislav and I grew up together. He was my cousin, older than me by 3 years. He'd always been the strong, confident one while I tended to be more shy and timid. I always looked up to him because of his brave and daring personality, and no more so when we went camping in the Kurgan Mountains. I was 10, and Stanislav was 13 when we hiked up the foothills of the Kurgan just outside our village near Moscow. I had caught some nice trout at the stream and was hiking back to our little camp when the scent attracted a rather large and hungry wolf. Not thinking to simply drop my pole and my catch, I ran with them up the trail, screaming for Stanislav to come and help. The wolf was nearly upon me when Stanislav appeared, suddenly at my side, batting the wolf with a sturdy branch which he had set ablaze with our campfire. As he got older, Stanislav had garnered the reputation of being a hard, stern man, uncompromising and intolerant of ineptitude and incompetence, especially during the war. But to me, he's always been the big brother that I never had who could save me from wolves. "So," I said, "what exactly are we investigating? Why does the army need air defense missiles and heavy machine guns to conduct a search for missing people?" "Mikhail," my cousin said calmly, though he stared at me with cold, unblinking eyes. "You served as a paratrooper during the war, so you know the value of secrecy and the importance of military intelligence. It is therefore of the utmost importance that the people trust in the results of our findings. More importantly, we need the Americans to trust in our findings. Therefore, nothing you write and no pictures you take are to leave from here until I personally say that it can go." He paused and inhaled deeply on his cigarette, though he never took his eyes off me. "You came highly recommended by Pravda's editor-in-chief, Mikhail. However, if you cannot follow orders, you can also be highly recommended to be replaced. It's not my call. Those are simply my orders." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled a picture out of a small envelope, placing it on the desk in front of the colonel. "Stanislav," I said, "is this what we're searching for?" Stanislav picked up the photograph and stared at the image of the glowing object seemingly descending from a cloudy sky. The object seemed to be metallic and emitted a bright orange flame. "I am aware that you were given this picture, cousin," said Colonel Andreev, taking the cigarette out of his mouth. He dropped the picture on the desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a large mailing envelope. "Here, take a look at this picture." The picture was the same as the one I had of the mysterious object, only blown up in a greater detail. I put my hand to my mouth, my mind reeling at the implications of what I was seeing before me. "As you can see," said Andreev, "we enlarged the image so that you can just barely see the swastika on the side.